Good evening and welcome. I am Uyai Anekan coming to you live from Uyo, the capital city of Akwa Ibom State, Nigeria. This is Spotlight Africa, brought to you by Spectrum Television and Planet Radio. Today on Spotlight Africa, Gabon junta leader turns down presidential salary. South African and Ukraine leaders discuss grain deal revival. President William Ruto signs controversial UHC bill. Jailed Senegal opposition leader resumes hunger strike. Plus, Chad confirms death from dengue as cases rise. These stories are all just ahead on Spotlight Africa. Do stay with us. We begin Spotlight Africa from Gabon, where military leader General Brice Oligui Nguema has said he's given up his salary as president and will only receive a wage for commander of the Republican Guard. He became the interim president following the overthrow of President Ali Bongo in August. Wednesday night's announcement was made by the junta spokesperson, who said General Nguema took the decision because he was aware of the social emergencies and many expectations of the Gabonese people. Deposed President Bongo's 14-year rule was marred by allegations of corruption and other financial scandals, with the junta saying the country's finances are victim of a real criminal fury. Apart from renouncing his salary as president, General Nguema also decided to reduce public spending by slashing the allowances for lawmakers, eliminating political funds and cutting session allowances. The presidency said this could consolidate the state funds. Meanwhile, the latest move has been seen as an attempt to restore the Gabonese people's confidence in the country's leadership. Away from that, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and his Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky have confirmed their shared desire for a peaceful resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The two held talks on Tuesday at the request of the Ukrainian president, the South African presidency said in a statement on Wednesday. It said Mr. Ramaphosa welcomes Zelensky's commitment to the revival of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and both leaders pledged to continue working together on that. Russia pulled out of the grain initiative brokered by the United Nations and Turkey in July 2022, which allowed the export of grain from Ukraine ports to global markets. Ukraine has since proposed the establishment of grain hubs in African ports. Recall that last month, Kenyan President William Ruto said that Ukraine had agreed to set up a grain hub in the port of Mombasa to supply the East African region. Now, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan are among countries that benefited from the Black Sea grain deal. Reports say during the talks, Ramaphosa also committed his country's commitment to active engagement in the Africa Peace Initiative, presented earlier this year by 7 African leaders as a possible basis for peace. He also committed to the participation of his country for talks in the peace formula outlined by Ukraine that are held at the level of national security advisors. Moving away from that, all beaches have been closed in the South African port city of Durban following heavy rains that affected the seawater near the coast. Now, according to authorities, the 2-day rains washed logs and other debris into the sea, while shark nets at most beaches were damaged, making beaches unsafe for public use. Residents have, however, been allowed to enjoy other activities along the beach that do not require them to come into contact with seawater. KwaZulu-Natal Province's disaster management teams said they evacuated several people whose homes were damaged by the rain. Efforts are underway to fix the net and infrastructure that were damaged by the torrential downpours in parts of the province. The South African Weather Service had on Monday issued a storm warning for disruptive rains, which led to the flooding. In the meantime, top South African opposition figure Julius Malema and his co-accused Andrine Seaman have failed in their bid to have charges related to the violation of the Firearms Act withdrawn against them. The Economic Freedom Fighters EFF leader allegedly fired a gun in public in 2018, which was allegedly handed over to him by his bodyguard Seaman. The two had pleaded not guilty to all 6 charges leveled against them. Malema addressed his supporters outside courts in East London following the judgment and accused the judge of being biased. Moving now to news from Kenya, President William Ruto has approved controversial legislation that will see the biggest shake-up of the health sector in more than 20 years. His plan revolves around promoting universal health care and requires all workers to contribute 2.75% of their salaries toward a new health fund. Now, the government says it will make health care more affordable and accessible for poorer Kenyans. But it was proved unpopular with many Kenyans who see it as a new tax. They say it is the latest in a series of measures that Ruto has introduced, worsening the cost of living crisis. Now, despite the fact that he won elections last year with a promise to ease the financial difficulties of families, some also fear that the new healthcare fund will be beset by corruption like the existing one, meaning they are often unable to access the health services they are entitled to. Meanwhile, still in Kenya, there is an initiation of evacuation of its citizens from Israel following the outbreak of war 10 days ago. Now, according to Roselyn Njogu, a senior official in charge of diaspora affairs at Kenya's foreign ministry, the first part of 11 evacuees is expected to arrive in Kenya later today. Currently, there are more than 500 nationals registered with the Kenyan embassy in Israel, with a significant number of them living in areas that remain safe and unaffected by the ongoing hostilities. They started on the 7th of October with an unprecedented assault on Israeli communities near the Gaza Strip by Palestinian Hamas militants. Israel has retaliated with strikes on Gaza, and a ground offensive is expected. In the meantime, Kenyans have been expressing outrage after authorities destroyed goods being sold by street traders in the capital, Nairobi, prompting an apology from the governor. Images of sewages and eggs strewn on the streets have been widely shared online. Some of the food, sausages vendors are seen standing by counting their losses as their trolleys are impounded and loaded onto a lorry. Kenyans have rallied in support of the traders, including initiating campaigns to raise money for one hawker whose trolley was vandalized. President William Ruto campaigned and won the last year's election after promising to champion the interest of the hustlers. Meanwhile, Nairobi Governor Johnson Sakaja has apologized, saying the Wednesday morning events were most unfortunate, promising disciplinary action against officers involved. Still in Kenya, a man in Kenya accused of practicing law without qualifications has pleaded not guilty in court. Named Brian Mweda Njagi on the charge sheet, he was arraigned in court in the capital Nairobi today following his arrest on Tuesday. He faces charges of forging official documents to practice as a lawyer and identity theft, dubbed the fake lawyer by local media. He's reported to have won dozens of lawsuits despite not being trained. In another development, Malawi's President Lazarus Chakwera has expressed concern over the security of hundreds of Malawians in Israel amid escalating war between Israeli forces and Hamas. Chakwera expressed support for Israel and condemned the attacks against unarmed civilians and the captivity of civilians by the militant Palestinian group Hamas. The Malawi leader calls for the cessation of the Gaza violence, which has drawn global attention. In a separate development, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni has condemned the killing of 2 tourists who he said were on their honeymoon and a guide by suspected Islamist militants. Reports say the trio were killed and their vehicle burned in the Queen Elizabeth National Park, which borders the Democratic Republic of Congo. The tourists were from the United Kingdom and South Africa, while their guide was Ugandan. Meanwhile, Museveni blamed the killings on members of the Allied Democratic Forces (ADF), calling them a small group of terrorists running away from operations in Congo. Away from that, the Senegalese opposition leader Ousmane Sonko says he has resumed the hunger strike. He was jailed several months ago on various charges, including criminal association with a terrorist enterprise and undermining state security. He says the charges were instigated by President Macky Sall and aimed at preventing him from running in presidential elections deemed for next year. In July, after years of uncertainty over his political future, Sall said he would not be seeking a third term in office in 2024. Sonko said his renewed action was a demonstration of solidarity with other activists who had been unjustly arrested for expressing their political opinions. Since 2021, there have been many protests in Senegal in support of Sonko, which have left dozens dead. Elsewhere, Algeria's Foreign Minister Ahmed Attaf has called on the international community to support the Palestinians, with whom he said Algeria stood in full solidarity as the Israel-Hamas war intensifies. Speaking at the 20th session of the ministerial meeting of African and Nordic countries in Algiers, Attaf said people in the Gaza Strip are living in a deplorable humanitarian condition. Meanwhile, the Algeria's Supreme Security Council issued a statement stressing its rejection of the occupation operations against defenseless civilians and emphasized its solidarity with the Palestinian people. Yet in another development, 9 Tanzanians have been evacuated from Israel and have arrived in Dar es Salaam, where they have been received by government officials, family and friends. Students Lucas Malaki told newsmen that he was relieved to be home after days of fear. The country's ambassador to Israel says there are still around 350 Tanzanians in Israel awaiting government plans to evacuate them. Many are agricultural students. The embassy added that the search for 2 students who are reportedly missing in the aftermath of the recent Hamas attack on Israel communities near the Gaza Strip remains fruitless. In a related development, the hospital blast in Gaza, which has killed hundreds of people, including many children, has prompted anger in several African countries. In Tunisia, pro-Palestinian protesters rallied outside the French embassy in the capital, Tunis, condemning Western countries for their support of Israel, which they blamed for the attack. Israel's military said the hospital was hit by a failed Palestinian rocket launch, but Palestinian officials blamed an Israeli airstrike. The ICC drops charges against CAR militia member. Stay tuned for details of this and more after this time out. Thanks for staying tuned, and now to the rest of the news stories on Spotlight Africa. On a rather sad development, 5 children, including 4 siblings, have died in Zimbabwe following heavy rains and floods that have damaged houses and key infrastructure. Now, according to reports, 4 of them died after being struck by lightning while sleeping with their mother in a hut in the eastern Mansiland province. The mother was unhurt. The other child died from head injuries following flooding that damaged more than 17 homes at a village in Kokwe North in the central Midlands province. Meanwhile, 2 other children from the same village are reported to have been taken to hospital. It comes amid widespread heavy rains accompanied by thunderstorms, strong winds and hail in places between Monday and Tuesday, according to the Meteorological Agency. Away from that, an internal investigation has found that a fire that gutted South Africa's parliament in January 2022 could have been prevented. The findings show that 5 people have been implicated in a series of systems and security failures which preceded the blaze that took 3 days to extinguish. Reports say no parliamentary protection officers were on duty on the night of the fire because it was a public holiday. The probe also found that no one was monitoring security cameras and that the sprinkler systems, smoke detectors, and a number of CCTV cameras were not working at the time. It was also revealed that the fire-gutted building had not been insured. In a separate development, Chad has confirmed one death from an outbreak of dengue fever, with more than 1,342 suspected cases so far, including 41 that have been confirmed. These figures are up to the beginning of October, covering the period since the country declared dengue outbreak in August, according to the World Health Organization (WHO). Chad's health ministry is currently responding to the outbreak amid concerns of the disease spreading further because of limited capabilities for surveillance and response. According to reports, the Abichi Health District in the southeastern Alder province is the epicenter of the current outbreak. Dengue is transmitted by mosquitoes and often causes mild flu-like symptoms with no specific treatment. Timely detection and management are vital. Cases in communities are likely to be underreported because clinicians often confuse its symptoms with other infections, making early diagnosis challenging, especially in areas with limited testing facilities. Meanwhile, the WHO classes the outbreak as the high national level risk due to favorable environmental conditions for mosquitoes spreading and an ongoing humanitarian crisis in the region involving influx of refugees from Sudan. Meanwhile, Ivory Coast Prime Minister Robert Mbembe has taken charge of the sports ministry as the country prepares to host the Africa Cup of Nations in January. His appointment comes amid concerns about the West African nation's readiness for the continent's premier football tournament. Recall that the previous sports minister was sacked last week amid criticism over the poor quality of the main stadium in Ivory Coast. The country has 6 venues which will host matches in January. Meanwhile, Mbambi oversaw the organization of the Francophone Games in 2017. In Turkey, company Karapovic has restored power to Guinea-Bissau's capital after shutting off supplies for nearly 2 days. The company had cut off power to Bissau in the early hours of Tuesday over an unpaid bill of at least $15 million, plunging the city into darkness. A car power ship spokesperson told newsmen that the company was able to resume operations after receiving a payment from the government. Energy Minister Yusuf Balde said $6 million of the $15 million bill had been paid. The spokesperson of the car power ship, which has been supplying power to Guinea-Bissau since 2019, said that the decision to temporarily suspend operations was not made easily. Away from that, the widow of a prominent Pakistani journalist is suing the Kenyan government for the targeted assassination of her husband. Javira Siddiq filed a lawsuit in Nairobi on Wednesday for the wrongful murder of Ashard Sharif. According to reports, the journalist was shot and killed a year ago by officers of Kenya's elite police force, the General Service Unit, GSU. Meanwhile, the officers involved in the incident said it was a case of mistaken identity, but the widow has disputed the GSU's claim. Lastly, on Spotlight Africa, a coalition of civil societies in the Democratic Republic of Congo has held a protest in Goma, calling for the exit of a combined East African force from the east of the country over its failure to deal with the M23 rebels. Recall that in November of last year, Kenya, Burundi, Uganda, and South Sudan sent troops to DR Congo under the banner of the East African Community Regional Force to try and disarm the rebel group and bring peace. Meanwhile, the M23 has continued to hold some towns and villages in North Kivu province. 7 people were killed earlier this month in the area. Last week, DR Congo spokesperson Patrick Muyaya confirmed to newsmen that his government would not be renewing the EACRF mandate. He said that Congolese troops would do a better job, adding that the EACRF should leave at the end of the mandate this December. And that's all we have for you at this time. Do also follow us on social media. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, all of which you can find on our website, spectrumtv.ng. This has been Spotlight Africa, brought to you by Planet Radio and Spectrum Television, touchlighting on news all around the continent. My name is Uyai Anyek, and thanks for being a part of this, and do enjoy the rest of your evening.